On the morning of October 23, 1869, Charles Burden, a Missouri farmer, walked into Attorney George Vest's office. The goal, to file a lawsuit against his neighbor Leónidas Hornsby. The reason, the crime committed against his dog Old Drum. Vest, one of the most prestigious lawyers in the nation, looked at the man in astonishment. Never before in the history of law had a person been put on trial for the death of an animal. Nevertheless, when the attorney saw the reflection of pain and sorrow in Burden's eyes, he decided to take the case. Unbeknownst to him, George Vest had made a decision that would forever change the justice system's perception of animals. And that case, which at first glance seemed a lost and insignificant cause, turned into one of the most emblematic trials in history. His argument became the foundation of animal jurisprudence in the United States, and its outcome the key that would open the doors to the fight for their rights. On the morning of October 19, 1869, Charles Burden, a 45-year-old farmer, was descending a hillside near his farm when, at the edge of the creek, he saw a figure lying there. His hound's body lay motionless on the grass, with fur stained with blood and eyes glassy and lifeless. Old Drum, his faithful companion, the dog who had accompanied him for years, was dead. It had not been an accident. The wound was a gunshot wound. And Burden knew exactly who had done it. His neighbor and brother-in-law, Leónidas Hornsby, a man of sour disposition and a sharp tongue who had vowed to shoot any dog that set foot on his property. When Burden went to confront him, Hornsby denied pulling the trigger, but confessed that his nephew, Dick Ferguson, had killed a dog to scare it off. The insinuation and the contempt with which he referred to the incident were as insulting as the crime itself. Old Drum was not just another dog. He was an inseparable companion whom he had raised from a pup, a brave, intelligent, and loyal hound. Burden knew he could not leave it at that. What for others was a simple rural dispute was, for him, an unforgivable injustice. At that moment, he had two options: either take the law into his own hands or file a legal complaint against Hornsby. But there was a bigger problem. As of 1869, the law did not recognize rights for animals. The courts treated dogs the way one would treat a shovel or a chair. They were just another object, property without sentimental value. Animals did not enjoy legal protection before the courts, which made it unlikely that any lawyer would agree to bring a complaint of that kind before a tribunal. Even so, he chose the latter and decided to take the risk. He went to the Warrensburg court to seek justice, but the authorities' response was categorical. Dogs are not human beings, and therefore they do not have equal rights under the law. It was not possible to open a criminal case against a person for having committed a crime against an animal. In that case, the only thing that could be done was to seek monetary damages. The maximum the law allowed was $150. That was a symbolic sum, not even enough to cover the legal fees, but for the farmer, this dispute was not about money. Charles Burden knew there was only one lawyer in town who could take a case like that. George Graham Vest was one of the most prestigious attorneys in the entire nation. Vest had been a congressman for Missouri, a Confederate congressman during the Civil War, and for a time he had worked as a legislator in the White House. He was famous for his gifts as an orator and his rhetorical skills. But above all, Vest was known for his deep sense of justice and his empathy for victims. And that morning, when Burden walked into his office, he saw in those sad eyes and in his moving words a broken man who had suffered the loss of something more than a mere animal. He had lost a piece of himself. The farmer's complaint was not about money. He was not seeking material compensation for the harm done. He sought something much more important to him, but above all for Old Drum, justice. He sued Leónidas Hornsby for damages, alleging the loss of a valuable animal. At that moment, no one imagined that this seemingly simple act would become a legal battle that would change the way an entire society understood the relationship between humans and animals. At first, the case seemed minor. But when Vest heard Burden's account and understood what Old Drum meant to him, something changed inside him. It was not just a dispute between neighbors. It was about defending the idea that a bond between man and animal could be as sacred as any human relationship. Vest prepared his strategy in silence. While an ordinary attorney would argue laws, values, and precedents, he was thinking of something deeper. He thought about how a voiceless creature could inspire a speech that pierced hearts and broke through the ice of skepticism. And so, in silence and in the dark of night, he began to craft an argument that would later become an academic document for future generations of lawyers. The lawsuit was filed in the Johnson County Court. Hornsby, with his usual arrogance, hired attorneys to ridicule the case. "A trial over a dog," they said. In an era when horses were worth more than any other four-legged creature, defending a hound before a jury seemed a waste of time. The courtroom filled up during each of the sessions of the trial. In total, 4 hearings were held. Each drew more public, more tension, and more media attention. Some mocked Burden, saying he was crazy for taking Hornsby to court over an insignificant dog. Others began to sympathize with his pain. There was something honest and visceral in that loss, something that echoed in everyone. The defense was based on denial. Without clear proof of who exactly fired the shot, they had no way to demonstrate their client's guilt. Hornsby seemed very confident. He was sure the case would be dismissed. But the forensic evidence, though rudimentary for the time, was clear. Old Drum died from a point-blank shot and was dragged to the creek. Everything pointed to Hornsby's nephew and, by extension, to Hornsby himself. The trial dragged on for months. The jury struggled to reach a conclusive decision. The evidence was not sufficiently compelling to convict Hornsby, but because of his evident involvement in the events, they could not exonerate him either. It was not until the final hearing, when everything seemed exhausted, that something happened which changed everything. Vest asked to speak. He stood before the jury and clasped his hands behind his back. What followed was not a legal argument. It was a piece of emotional oratory that forever transformed the history of jurisprudence. The words of George Graham Vest did not speak of laws or evidence. They spoke of love, of loss, of fidelity. He did not mention the name Old Drum even once during the speech, but everyone knew he was speaking of him. The chamber was silent. George Graham Vest, standing on the dais and without looking at papers, raised his voice with a calm that chilled those present. The jury, the lawyers, the judge, and the spectators watched him attentively. No one imagined that, within minutes, they would be hearing the most memorable speech in the judicial history of the United States. Vest did not appeal to the civil code. He did not cite precedents, nor did he try to convince the jury by way of the evidence. He spoke to the heart. He spoke of the dog as the purest mirror of the human soul. His firm, emotional voice reverberated through the courtroom, which had become the platform where not only Old Drum, but all the animals who until that day had gone unnoticed by justice would be vindicated. His words were as follows: "The best friend a man can have in this world may turn against him and become his enemy. His own son or daughter, whom he has raised with love, may show him ingratitude. He to whom he entrusts his honor and his name may become a traitor. The money a man has may be lost. A man's reputation may be sacrificed in a moment of reckless action. Those who are quick to kneel and honor us when success accompanies us may be the first to cast the stone of malice when failure clouds our judgment. The only absolutely selfless friend a man can have in this selfish world, the one who never abandons him, the one who is never ungrateful nor treacherous, is his dog. A man's dog remains at his side in prosperity and in poverty, in health and in sickness. He will sleep on the cold ground where the icy wind blows if only he is near his master. He will kiss the hand that has no food to offer him. He will lick the wounds of the body and the wounds of life. He guards his poor master's sleep as if he were a prince. When all other friends leave, he remains. When wealth departs and reputation sinks, He is as constant in his love as the sun in the sky. If by chance the master becomes a pariah, the dog asks no greater privilege than to accompany him, to protect him from danger and to fight his enemies. And when the last scene comes, when death takes the master in its cold embrace, and his body is borne to the earth, whether or not all other friends go their way, there, beside his grave, will be found the noble animal, with his head between his paws, his eyes sad but open in watchful vigilance, faithful and loyal, even unto death. Not a single sigh was heard in the chamber. Not a single heart failed to feel the truth in those words. Many in the audience had to bring their hands to their faces to wipe away their tears. That, more than an argument, was a tribute to the unconditional love of pets for their owners. A love that gives everything in return for nothing, or perhaps in return for a single thing: companionship. Hornsby's lawyer made a final attempt to regain the jury's attention and emotions, but there was nothing to be done. Vest's oratory had been overwhelming. No argument the defense could offer would reverse the jury's decision. Vest and his supporters knew it. On the faces of the judges and the audience, the verdict could be read. The scales of justice had tipped completely to one side, that of Charles Burden and his dog Old Drum. The trial was no longer about a dead dog. It was about the humanity of humans and the recognition of the pure loyalty that was so often scorned. The jury deliberated briefly. A few minutes were enough to deliver a unanimous verdict. Charles Burden was right. Hornsby was ordered to pay damages of $550, a modest sum for such an irreparable loss, but $400 more than the law then allowed. It was the first time a court publicly recognized the emotional and moral importance of an animal in a person's life. Hornsby's lawyers appealed to the Missouri Supreme Court hoping to reverse the verdict, but it upheld the judgment. Old Drum, unjustly slain, had won the case. Burden achieved the unthinkable. Not only did he obtain justice, but he made an entire system see animals differently. However, what no one foresaw was the repercussion of that trial over time. The local press began to disseminate the speech, then the state newspapers. Afterwards, it reached Washington, and finally, the entire country. Vest's speech became required reading in schools, universities, and law schools. From this case, a shift in social perception about animal rights slowly began to take shape. In the following decades, animal protection laws began to be discussed in various states. The case of Old Drum was cited in legal texts, philosophical essays, and political debates, not as a technical precedent, but as an emotional testament to what the bond between a human and an animal meant. The trial was a crack in the wall of traditional thought. Through that crack, a new light began to seep in. The idea that animals were not simply things, but beings of worth, capable of feeling, of loving, and of being loved. During the 20th century, the name Old Drum was taken up by activists, legislators, and defenders of animal rights. His story was adapted into plays, academic articles, documentaries, and public speeches. It also inspired campaigns against animal cruelty and for more humane legislation. In 1958, 88 years after the trial, the city of Warrensburg, Missouri, decided to immortalize the hound. In front of the Johnson County Courthouse, a bronze statue was erected in his honor. There, an upright, alert dog silently watches over the place. On the base, solemnly engraved, one can read George Graham Vest's plea, now known as Tribute to the Dog. The monument became a place of pilgrimage not only for animal lovers but for lawyers, historians, and students of civil rights. The statue is a reminder that even the smallest gestures can become universal symbols. Earlier than this, in 1947, a monument was erected a few meters from the spot where Old Drum had been found lifeless. Those monuments are not merely tributes. They are reminders that love, even when it comes from a voiceless being, has the right to be defended. Old Drum was buried beside a creek where he used to run free, but his story crossed fields, courthouses, and generations. With his death, he achieved what millions of living beings had not. He made humanity open its eyes. In the 21st century, animal protection laws have multiplied. There are statutes that punish abuse, regulations that promote responsible adoption, and even legal initiatives that recognize animals as subjects of rights in some countries. Although Old Drum's name does not appear in any of the clauses, it is engraved in the spirit of each law. His story was the first great public narrative in which not only compassion but justice was demanded, and justice answered. George Graham Vest continued his political career and a few years later became a United States Senator. However, in his memoirs, he never mentioned his achievements as a legislator. What he remembered most, and what he was proudest of, was having been Old Drum's voice in that rural Missouri courtroom. As for Charles Burden, he lived the rest of his life on the same farm. He never had another dog. He said that none could match Old Drum's fidelity. He died decades later. The remains of Charles Burden and George Graham Vest rest in Hornsby Cemetery in Kingsville, Missouri, separated by only a few meters, though united in the same story.